Samantha Reed thought she was falling in love with a charming, experienced pilot named Brian Dalton, but what began as a secret affair at 30,000 feet quickly spiraled into a chilling descent through lies, surveillance, and a trail of mysterious disappearances that would end in murder. Samantha Reed had always found comfort in the sky. From the moment she stepped into a plane as a young girl, something about flying made the world feel manageable. At 29, she was confident, capable, and carried herself with quiet strength. As a flight attendant for Pacific Skies Airlines, she moved from city to city with ease, living out of suitcases and hotel rooms, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Her life, while solitary, was built around routine. Early morning departures, red-eye returns, and the occasional layover in a foreign country. She had no family nearby, no children, and no real relationships outside of a few friends on the crew. She liked it that way. Or at least she told herself she did. Everything changed on a flight from Chicago to San Diego when she was assigned to work with Captain Brian Dalton for the first time. Brian was seasoned, in his mid-40s, and carried the kind of charm that made passengers trust him instantly. He had a firm handshake, a deep voice, and a calm confidence that made turbulence feel like a gentle breeze. Samantha noticed him immediately, not because he was particularly handsome, but because of the way he made everyone feel like they were the only person in the room. He smiled at her that day in the cockpit, introduced himself like it was the beginning of a partnership, and made her laugh during the pre-flight checks. There was an ease between them, something unspoken that neither one acknowledged but both clearly felt. At first it was harmless. They joked during flights, chatted in the crew lounge, and shared a few drinks during layovers. Samantha knew he was married. His wedding ring was always on, and he often mentioned his kids in passing. Still, there was something magnetic between them. When their schedules began aligning more frequently, Samantha couldn't help but wonder if it was coincidence or if Brian was subtly pulling strings behind the scenes. Then came the night in Denver. A snowstorm had grounded their flight, and the crew was stuck at a nearby hotel. They had dinner, just the two of them, and afterward they sat in the lobby for hours. When he touched her hand, everything changed. From that night forward, they were no longer just co-workers. The affair escalated quickly. They kept things discreet, but there was always risk. Samantha told herself she was in control. She believed the lies he told her that his marriage was ending, that he and his wife hadn't been close in years, that she was the one thing that made him feel alive, and she believed it all because she wanted to. She had never felt that kind of connection with anyone. It was as if she'd spent her entire life floating and had finally found someone to ground her. As the months went on, Samantha fell deeper. They coordinated schedules to ensure they flew together. They spent nights in each other's rooms during layovers and sent secret messages during flights. Samantha began imagining a future beyond hotels and airports. She started researching neighborhoods in Denver, looking at apartments she could afford on her own. She pictured morning coffee on a quiet porch, holidays spent with Brian's children, even though she hadn't met them yet. In her heart, it felt like the real thing, but cracks started to appear. First, there were the late replies to her texts. Then the last-minute cancellations. Brian began pulling away without explanation. He was still affectionate in person, but distant otherwise. Samantha tried to ignore it, blaming it on stress or family obligations. She told herself to be patient. Love wasn't always convenient, and real relationships took work. But her patience wore thin when she began receiving anonymous messages. At first, it was just a single message through an unknown number. "He's lying to you." Samantha deleted it and told no one. But then more messages came, some threatening, some coldly factual. They included specific details about her and Brian, where they had stayed, what she had worn. One message referenced the scar on Brian's shoulder, something she'd only seen when they were alone together. Whoever was sending the messages wasn't guessing, they knew. Samantha grew paranoid. She checked her phone constantly, looked over her shoulder in airports, and started sleeping with the light on. Still, she didn't confront Brian. She was afraid of what she might hear. Then came the flight from New York to Dallas. It was uneventful for the passengers, but for Samantha, something felt off. In first class, there was a woman who didn't speak, didn't eat, and didn't look away from her for the entire trip. She wore sunglasses and a hat, even though the cabin was dimly lit, every time Samantha passed by. The woman's eyes followed her. It wasn't until the passengers disembarked that Samantha allowed herself to breathe again. She never saw the woman's face, but the encounter stayed with her. When she told Brian about it, he shrugged it off. Probably just a nervous flyer, he said, but Samantha wasn't convinced. The next day, she returned to her apartment to find her front door unlocked. Nothing appeared stolen. The TV was still there, the jewelry untouched, but the air inside felt heavy, like someone had just left. On her kitchen table was a printed photo one she had never seen before. It showed Brian with his wife and 2 children, standing outside a theme park. Samantha S.'s face had been taped over the wife S. and then crossed out with thick black marker. That night, Samantha couldn't sleep. Every noise made her flinch. She turned her phone off, pulled the curtains shut, and sat by the door with a kitchen knife in hand. She knew something was wrong, and it was getting worse. The messages, the strange woman, the break-in, it wasn't a coincidence. Someone was trying to scare her, and it was working. Still, she didn't go to the police. She didn't want to ruin Brian's life, didn't want the affair to become public. She still believed he loved her. She still believed he would protect her. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't yet see, was that everything she thought was true about Brian, about their relationship, and about her own safety was about to be shattered. The calm skies were behind her. Ahead lay a storm she never could have imagined. The morning after Samantha found the photo on her kitchen table, the world felt colder. She walked through her apartment as if it were a stranger's home, noticing every detail that seemed even slightly out of place. A lamp tilted to the side. A picture frame facing the wrong way. The faint scent of unfamiliar cologne in the air. He kept to the cockpit, only emerging briefly for protocol checks. Samantha noticed the absence immediately. He didn't linger in the galley, he didn't crack jokes like he used to. And when she caught him looking at her once, his expression was unreadable cold, even. She sat by the window, watching the parking lot below, every pair of headlights triggering a fresh wave of panic. She didn't explain much, only asked if he could check the flight logs and look into the manifest from the last few flights. He said he found several discrepancies in the passenger logs from her recent flights' names that didn't match IDs, missing seat assignments and access logs showing edits from unauthorized terminals. It was more than just one mistake, it was a pattern. She hadn't ordered anything. The box was small, plain, with no label, voicemail. She sent a message begging for the truth. Was Jennifer behind this? Did he know what was happening? Had he seen the photo? No response. Hours passed. Still nothing. And then, just after 2 a.m., she received a single message. End this or it ends you. Inside was a single item, a pair of her own earrings, the ones she had lost weeks ago in a hotel room during a layover with Brian. Someone had been watching her closely, waiting for her next move. And now the stakes were about to rise, because the person following her wasn't just trying to scare her, they were planning something much worse, something that would turn her fear into a full-blown nightmare. She didn't name names. She didn't mention the affair. She kept the lights on and checked the locks 3 times. Just before dawn, a noise outside her window made her jump. She looked through the curtain and saw a figure in a dark coat standing across the street, watching her building. By the time she opened the door, the figure was gone. She only cited potential security risks involving altered records. She hoped someone in management would take it seriously. The airline wasn't listening, Brian had vanished, and the police wouldn't take anonymous threats seriously without proof. So she made the decision to contact a private investigator. She found one online with good reviews, a former detective named Ray Lanning. She sent him a brief email explaining her situation, leaving out the affair for now. He replied quickly and agreed to meet the next day. Instead, she was called into a meeting and given a warning for unauthorized access of confidential data. Her concerns were dismissed, and she was told to take a few days off. She stared at them, trying to understand how they had returned. They had been gone, she was sure of it. Now they were back, hand-delivered by someone who wanted her to know they'd been watching. Someone had been tampering with records, and it was linked to flights she and Brian worked together. Kyle told her to be careful, then abruptly ended the call. Kyle agreed, though his tone suggested he was hesitant. Before hanging up, he asked her if everything was okay. Samantha told him it was just a small concern. She couldn't bring herself to say the truth aloud. Around midnight, she opened her laptop and began researching. She searched the airline's passenger records, trying to confirm the identity of the woman in 4A. Someone with technical knowledge and access? The obvious suspect was Jennifer Dalton, Brian's wife. But how could she have the skills to alter flight reds unless she had help? Samantha began to wonder if there was more to Jennifer than a betrayed spouse. Maybe she was capable of more than jealousy. Maybe rage had turned her into something else entirely. Nothing came up. The name on the manifest didn't exist. It was a ghost entry. Samantha's access didn't allow her to dig deeper, but she had a feeling someone had deliberately altered the records. The thought made her stomach twist. For the first time since their affair began, Samantha felt alone. She checked the locks twice before leaving for work, heart pounding the entire time. The fear was no longer abstract. It was real, present, and sitting just beneath her skin. At the airport, the familiar chaos of boarding gates and rolling suitcases felt distant. She forced herself to focus, to smile at passengers, to go through the motions. Brian was already on the plane when she boarded. He stood near the cockpit, speaking with the co-pilot, his tone relaxed. When he turned and saw her, he gave a small nod, a gesture that once made her heart flutter. Now it barely registered. Something between them had shifted. Throughout the flight, Brian avoided her. She tried to bury her thoughts in work, but nothing distracted her for long. The woman in seat 4A was back. Or at least someone who looked just like her. Instead, she was told by the front desk that he had checked into a different hotel near the airport. No explanation. No message, just gone. It was a calculated move. He didn't want to see her. Samantha stood in the lobby for several minutes, frozen. Something was terribly wrong, and Brian wasn't going to help her figure it out. She was dressed differently this time, in a conservative blazer, but the posture, the silence, and the way her eyes tracked Samantha's every movement were unmistakable. Samantha passed her several times, pretending not to notice. But inside she was unraveling. After landing in Dallas, Samantha rushed to the crew hotel, hoping to speak to Brian. She needed answers. That night in her room, Samantha couldn't sleep. The next day, she made a call to an old friend from training, Kyle, who now worked in airline operations. By the end of the week, Kyle called her back. His voice was shaky. Samantha's mind raced. If someone was manipulating flight data and tracking her movements, it had to be someone inside the airline. Later that night, Samantha received a delivery at her apartment. That night, she called Brian again. No answer. She tried his personal number. The next day, Samantha filed an internal report with the airline, outlining her concerns in vague language. Feeling defeated, Samantha returned home and tried to rest. Samantha knew she couldn't keep living like this. She needed help, real help. What Samantha didn't know was that by reaching out to Ray, she had already crossed the line. The air in the small downtown cafe where Samantha met Ray Lanning was warm, but her hands were cold. She sat near the back, facing the entrance, glancing up every time the door opened. When Ray finally arrived, she recognized him immediately. Tall, with a weathered face and alert eyes, he had the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen too much and learned not to show it. He didn't ask for much information during their first meeting, just enough to understand the situation. She told him about the messages, the woman on the plane, the photo in her apartment, and the missing earrings. She left out her affair with Brian, not because she wanted to protect him, but because she didn't yet know if Ray could be trusted. She needed help, not judgment. Ray listened, nodded occasionally, and took a few notes. He asked for the exact flight numbers, the dates, and any screenshots she had of the threatening messages. He didn't make any promises, only said he'd look into it and get back to her in a few days. Samantha left the cafe feeling like she'd done the right thing. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel entirely alone. The next day, Ray called with a question that sent a chill through her. He wanted to know who had access to her flight schedules beyond the airline. She paused, thinking. Other than Brian, no one. She didn't share her rosters publicly. She asked why. Ray said someone had been logging into her work email from multiple locations, one in Florida, another in Nevada. Someone was watching her accounts, possibly mirroring her device. It wasn't random. It was planned. Samantha's heart sank. She hadn't noticed any signs of hacking. No password change notifications, no obvious glitches. But Ray said whoever did it knew what they were doing. It had likely started months ago. He asked if she had ever connected to public Wi-Fi without using protection. Of course she had airports, hotels, coffee shops. It was part of the job. Ray explained that 1 week moment was all it took. He also found something else. A name she had never heard before, Rachel Thorne. It came up linked to several anonymous social media accounts that had followed Samantha for months. They were inactive, nearly blank, but all had the same recovery email address. Ray traced that email to a tech consultant who briefly worked on Pacific Sky's internal systems, a man named Neil Mercer. Neil had been fired 2 years ago under vague circumstances. No one at the airline spoke about him, but Ray found that Neil had once worked with Jennifer Dalton at a nonprofit years earlier. They had been close, possibly more. It was the first concrete connection tying Jennifer to someone with access to airline systems. The pieces were starting to form a picture. Jennifer hadn't been acting alone. She had helped someone inside the system who could alter flight records, access emails, and watch Samantha's every move. And if Neil was still obsessed with Jennifer, he might have been helping her out of loyalty or revenge. But things took a darker turn that same week. Ray stopped returning calls. At first, Samantha assumed he was busy, then days passed with no update. She emailed him, no reply. She called his office, disconnected. She drove to the address listed on his website, only to find the building empty, his name removed from the directory. Panic set in. She went to the police, bringing printouts of her emails with Ray, copies of his business license, and a summary of everything she'd told him. The officer at the desk listened, but seemed uninterested. There was no official missing persons report, no evidence of a crime. They told her they would look into it, but Samantha could see in their eyes that nothing would happen. To them, it sounded like paranoia. 2 days later, Ray's car was found on a rural road outside the city. It was locked, the keys in the ignition, and his laptop was missing. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no witnesses, just an abandoned vehicle with no clear explanation. The police opened an investigation but didn't share much with Samantha. She was left with more questions and a growing sense that someone was removing anyone who got too close. Now, more alone than ever, she tried calling Brian again. Still nothing. She searched for him online, checking news articles, social media, anything that could give her a sign of life. But he had gone dark. No new flight records, no employee logins. It was like he'd vanished. Then, late one evening, she received a package. There was no return address. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings, old stories about Pacific Skies pilots, crew incidents, and one brief article about a flight attendant named Megan Holt who had gone missing in 2018. Megan's case had been dismissed as a runaway, but when Samantha read the details, her skin crawled. Megan had worked the same route as her. She had also been linked to Brian Dalton. Samantha dug deeper. She found a second case from 2016, a flight attendant named Erica Vaughn, who had filed a harassment complaint against an unnamed pilot. She left the airline shortly after and was later found dead in what had been labeled a suicide. But the timeline, again, intersected with Brian's. It became clear to Samantha that she wasn't the only one. She was part of a pattern. Brian had a history of inappropriate relationships. Women came into his life and then vanished, were discredited, or ended up dead. And now he was missing too. But the question wasn't just what Brian had done. It was who had been covering for him: the airline, Jennifer, Neil. The deeper Samantha went, the more dangerous it became. And whoever was behind it all had already shown they were willing to erase people who asked too many questions. Samantha's world was collapsing. She stopped going outside. She covered her windows and left her phone off for days at a time. But it didn't matter. The packages kept coming. One morning, she found a USB drive in her mailbox. Against her better judgment, she plugged it into an old laptop. There were 3 files. The first was a video recording grainy footage of her and Brian in a hotel room, laughing, unaware they were being filmed. The second was an audio clip Brian's voice, talking to someone about getting rid of her. The third file was a photo, Ray, sitting in the cafe where they had met, looking over his shoulder like he'd just heard something behind him. Samantha stared at the screen, numb. This wasn't just harassment. It wasn't just a jealous wife or a disgruntled tech consultant. This was a network organized, calculating, and always one step ahead. She realized something terrifying. This wasn't about love or betrayal anymore. It was about control. She was no longer a person to them. She was a variable, one they were trying to eliminate. And unless she found a way to disappear first, she wouldn't survive what was coming next. The morning news broke like a thunderclap across the aviation world. Captain Brian Dalton was found dead in a hotel room near Los Angeles International Airport. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the TV screen as Samantha sat motionless on her couch, the remote still in her hand, forgotten. The anchor's voice was calm and clinical, stating that Dalton had been discovered by hotel staff after missing checkout. Cause of death: a single gunshot wound to the head. The weapon was found beside his body. Initial police reports suggested suicide. But Samantha knew immediately that something wasn't right. They wanted to meet. At the meeting, Samantha was placed on administrative leave. She simply said she needed space and was between jobs. Her cousin didn't ask many questions. The change of scenery helped at first. Her car was discovered 2 hours outside Denver, parked near a hiking trail. Her purse was still in the front seat. Her phone had been turned off, and there was no sign of struggle. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed her buying a bottle of water and walking toward the trail. She never came back. For a few days, Samantha walked around the neighborhood trying to clear her mind. She didn't want to drag anyone else into it. At first, Melissa was hesitant. But when Samantha mentioned the other missing flight attendants, Melissa became interested. They met in a small bookstore cafe in Tucson. Samantha brought copies of everything: emails, screenshots, flight logs, photos, even the packages. She knew she had made a mistake by thinking she could hide. They had found her once. They would do it again. She said there had always been rumors about a cover-up at Pacific Skies. Lawsuits that were settled quickly, employees who disappeared after complaints, and rumors of high-level protection. But no one had ever gone on record. Old employee records, flight schedules, incident reports, no new posts, no activity. She called the police, but they claimed Melissa hadn't been reported missing. It wasn't just a string of accidents or suicides or runaways. It was the same car she had seen outside the bookstore in Tucson. It had followed her once in Phoenix. She didn't approach. She didn't call the police. She simply turned around and walked back inside. It was a system, a method. And someone was cleaning up every trace. Samantha filed the report herself. It looked like Neil had been keeping track of multiple employees for years. Samantha was one of them, so was Brian. No stamp. No name. Inside was a photo taken from outside a window. It showed Samantha, curled up on her cousin's couch, asleep. She simply stood there, frozen, realizing that the nightmare wasn't behind her. So were at least 6 other women who had all left the airline suddenly. She stayed offline, avoided the news, and tried to convince herself that things were over. That Brian's death was the end of it all. They used vague language, inappropriate conduct, employee code of ethics violations, and made no reference to Brian's death or her complaints. But she understood. The airline was distancing itself. She was being quietly pushed out, branded as unstable. It was damage control, and she was the damage. They looked into Neil Mercer, the tech consultant tied to Jennifer. He was off the grid, no active address, no public job listings. She planned to write an article and blow the story open. Samantha felt a flicker of hope for the first time. Maybe someone would finally believe her. Maybe she wasn't crazy after all. But Melissa managed to track down a property deed in his name, hidden behind a shell company. It led them to a cabin in northern Utah, surrounded by forest, miles from the nearest town. Samantha didn't go with her, but Melissa promised to be careful. Brian would never check into a hotel without notifying the airline. He was too meticulous, too calculating. And he never missed a flight. Pilot's widow vanishes weeks after his mysterious death. She had never met Jennifer, never spoken to her, but her presence had loomed over every moment of her affair with Brian. They started arriving every few days, each unmarked, each carefully wrapped. Inside were fragments of her life, personal items she hadn't realized were missing. A flight pin she lost months ago. A hotel key card from Chicago. A coffee receipt from a layover in San Francisco. Each box was accompanied by a printed news article about Brian, Jennifer, or Samantha herself. Some articles had her photo circled in red ink. Others had headlines altered with handwritten words. She lied. She'd be next. Justice is coming. Now she was gone too. Just like Ray, just like Megan Holt, just like Erica Vaughn. The pattern was undeniable. The public fed on the drama. True crime blogs speculated that Jennifer had faked her own disappearance. Others believed she had been murdered to silence her. But no one had answers. Some whispered that it had to do with the scandal of his affair, which had apparently become a rumor spreading through internal circles. Others thought it was work-related stress. Only one message made her blood run cold. It came from an unknown number. Now you're all alone. The Brian she knew, for all his flaws, lived by structure. There were routines he never broke. Something about the entire story felt artificial, staged. But as she watched footage of police surrounding the hotel, she realized that asking questions in public could make her a target again. Her phone lit up with messages from former crew members, all expressing shock. Samantha didn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed with her laptop open, scanning every piece of information she could find about Brian's death. But the facts were few. No note had been found. Security camera footage from the hallway outside his room was missing for nearly 58 minutes during the time of death. The hotel claimed a glitch in their system. Police said there was no forced entry. It all felt too convenient. The next day, she was contacted by HR at Pacific Skies. She packed her things and moved in with a cousin in Arizona, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. She didn't explain the full story. But it wasn't. A week after the funeral held privately, with no airline representation, Jennifer Dalton disappeared. The media picked up the story quickly. Samantha stayed quiet, though inside she was unraveling. Then came the boxes. Her cousin began asking questions, but Samantha brushed them off. Desperate, Samantha contacted the journalist who had covered Brian's death most closely, Melissa Crane, a freelancer known for digging into airline scandals. Melissa listened carefully, her expression growing darker with each detail. Together, they started investigating anew. 3 days later, Melissa called. She said the cabin was empty but clearly used recently. There were files, dozens of them. Melissa said she needed time to sort through the files. But Melissa never published the article. A week later, her phone number was disconnected. Her email bounced back. Samantha searched the web and found nothing. By now, the message was clear. Anyone who got too close disappeared, one by one. One evening, as Samantha walked to the mailbox, she saw a white car parked down the street. When she opened her mailbox, there was a single envelope. And beneath it, a note, "We see everything." Her hands shook. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. It had just entered the next phase. The days following the photo in the mailbox passed in a blur. Samantha stopped leaving the house. She barely ate, barely slept, and lived in a constant state of fear. Every sound outside, every footstep, every passing car felt like a threat. She had lost her job, her reputation, her sense of safety, and now even her last thread of hope. Anyone who tried to help her had either vanished or ended up dead. The system wasn't just broken, it was actively working against her. And whoever was behind it knew exactly how to manipulate everything to make her seem like the unstable one. Her cousin, worried by her condition, urged her to get help. She suggested therapy, the police, even moving to another city. But Samantha had already done all of that, and it had only made things worse. She considered leaving the country, but something held her back. If she disappeared, the truth would die with her. And deep inside, she knew this story had to be exposed. Not just for herself, but for the other women: Megan Holt, Erica Vaughn, Melissa Crane, and even Jennifer Dalton, whose body had still never been found. One quiet morning, Samantha finally made a decision. She packed a small bag and boarded a bus heading north under a fake name. She changed her appearance, dyed her hair, wore glasses, and avoided using credit cards or any traceable devices. Her goal was simple: to survive long enough to gather enough proof to blow everything wide open. There was one person left she hadn't contacted, someone Melissa had mentioned before disappearing. His name was Elliot Brandt, a retired airline safety investigator who had worked as a consultant on several internal Pacific Skies cases. Melissa believed he had once filed a report about discrepancies in pilot behavior logs and crew complaints, but the airline had buried it. Elliot had gone off the radar years ago, but Samantha found a reference to him in a pilot forum, posting under an alias. She tracked him down to a small rural town in Idaho, where he ran a tiny bookstore near a closed airfield. When she approached him, he seemed cautious, his eyes narrowed like someone who had lived too long watching his back. But once she mentioned Brian Dalton, his expression changed. He invited her inside, locked the doors, and listened carefully. Elliot confirmed what she already suspected. Brian had been part of an internal investigation nearly a decade ago after an anonymous crew member filed multiple complaints against him for inappropriate behavior. But the report disappeared. The airline had swept it under the rug, afraid of public scandal. According to Elliot, Brian had connections at the executive-level people who protected him, manipulated records, and silenced victims. When Elliot tried to push the issue, he was forced into early retirement and warned not to speak about it again. He told Samantha about a private contractor hired by the airline to monitor personnel risks. The contractor's job was to gather intel on employees deemed problematic whistleblowers, accusers, or anyone involved in internal scandals. That contractor had ties to Neil Mercer. The pieces fit. Mercer had been watching Samantha from the start, likely contracted by the airline's shadow network. And Jennifer, in her emotional spiral, had probably turned to Neil for help, unknowingly stepping into something far more dangerous than she realized. Elliot handed Samantha a small drive. It contained copies of the files Melissa had uncovered before disappearing. Somehow, Elliot had received them through a secure Baxanala whistleblower drop site Melissa had used. Samantha stayed up all night reading the contents. Dozens of documents, blacked out HR memos, surveillance photos, internal emails, and crew scheduling patterns, all pointing to a network of manipulation and suppression. One file stood out. It detailed a list of flagged employees, people the airline had marked as liabilities. Next to each name was a note: resigned, terminated, missing, deceased. Samantha's name was at the bottom, marked with one word: pending. She knew then that it wasn't over. As long as she remained alive and free, she was a problem that needed to be resolved. But she also knew she now had something no one else had: a paper trail. She and Elliot devised a plan. They would leak the documents anonymously to several international journalists, upload them to whistleblower platforms, and schedule automatic releases if either of them went missing. The first leak went live 2 weeks later. A detailed expose was published by a European news outlet, outlining Pacific Sky's pattern of silencing employees and covering up misconduct. Within hours, the story went viral. Other victims began to come forward: former crew members who had also felt threatened, who had been forced into silence, who now finally had something to point to. Back in the U.S., the airline denied all allegations, calling them false and defamatory, but the momentum had already begun. Legal groups launched investigations, and national news networks picked up the story. Protesters gathered outside Pacific Sky's headquarters. Stock prices plummeted, public trust unraveled. But Samantha remained in hiding. Even with the truth out, she knew exposure came with a price. She moved frequently, used burner phones, and kept in touch with Elliot only through encrypted messages. They both knew someone might still come after them. The people behind the cover-ups wouldn't simply disappear. They were powerful, connected, and desperate to protect their secrets. 3 months after the story broke, Samantha received another envelope. No return address. Inside was a Polaroid of a man's hand holding a lighter beside a file folder labeled "Read." On the back of the photo, written in clean block letters, "You lit the match. Now watch it burn." She stared at the image, heart racing. It was a warning. A promise, but it didn't shake her like before. She was no longer the frightened woman hiding in shadows. They had tried to break her, isolate her, or erase her, but she had survived. She had exposed them, and now she wasn't alone. Weeks later, more documents surfaced leaked by another unknown insider. The story refused to die. Federal authorities launched formal inquiries, and former executives were subpoenaed. Some were indicted. Neil Mercer's name surfaced in connection with multiple corporate investigations. But he was gone, vanished without a trace. As the world finally began to see the truth, Samantha allowed herself one small moment of peace. She walked through a quiet park in a city where no one knew her name, sat on a bench under the sun, and took a deep breath. The scars would never fade, the fear would never fully leave. But the silence was over. Somewhere behind her, someone might still be watching, but now she didn't look back. She had already flown through the storm and lived.